Irish saint or Irish goddess, Christian feast or pagan festival. The story of Saint Brigid and Imbolc has puzzled scholars for quite some time now. But what do the actual Irish sources tell us? In digging out the origins of Imbolc, or Saint Brigid's Day, I've come across a fascinating body of research that reveals how far these traditions stretch back into the ancient Celtic past. Now, just as with the other festivals, Imbolc's story appears to begin with the Neolithic farmers of ancient Ireland, who tracked the turning of the seasons by establishing a cyclical calendar. Imbolc could well have been one of these dates, as it marks the very beginning of spring, when there is noticeably more sunlight, and we see the first stirrings of the growing year. One early Irish source, Cormac's Glossary, even claims that an early version of the festival's name, Oimelc, means sheep milking, that is, the time the sheep's milk comes. And it is indeed at this time of year that ewes begin to produce milk for their lambs. But beyond its agricultural connection, we don't know anything certain at all about the pre-Christian Imbolc. We don't know if any deities were specifically evoked or worshipped, or what rites or celebrations were carried out. Now, of course, by today, there is a general assumption that it's the pagan goddess Brigid who was celebrated at Imbolc. This is a modern idea based on the connection between Imbolc and one of Ireland's most beloved Christian saints, Brigid of Kildare, also known as the Mother Saint of Ireland. Various people have given different reasons for why we should consider this Saint Brigid to be a Christianized version of a pagan goddess. As you'll see from what I'm about to show you, there are lots of clues and suggestions, but nothing that explicit. How does a calendar date become sacred? The story of Imbolc and St. Brigid's Day shows us exactly that, through rare glimpses in medieval manuscripts that reveal how Christian and pre-Christian traditions began to merge. One of the earliest pieces of written evidence that connects St. Brigid with Imbolc and February 1st is found in the Martyrology of Oenchus, a medieval Irish text from the 10th or 11th century. It tells us, "They magnify February's calends, a shower of great, pure-coloured martyrs. Brigid the fair, strong, praiseworthy, chaste head of Erin's nuns." Now this is clearly referring to Saint Brigid of Kildare. Another early source that connects Brigid to Imbolc is the ancient Irish epic the Táin Bó Cúailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley. In describing the hero Cuchulain's feats, it mentions a period from the Monday before Samhain exactly until the Wednesday after the festival of spring. Then a later scribe has added a clarification that after the festival of spring means after the day of Brigid. Both of these ancient sources show how early Christians were already equating the spring festival with their saint. But unfortunately, these brief allusions to Imbolc and St. Brigid are all we really have in the earliest sources, and they tell us nothing about Imbolc's pre-Christian origins. Unlike Samhain, which appears frequently in early texts, Imbolc is rarely mentioned, and when it is, we get no description of its rites or ceremonies. Some scholars, like Graham Webster, have guessed that it might have been primarily a women's festival, practised by the women and carried out in secret away from profane male eyes. This theory does align with the festival's connections to sheep milk and fertility and the emergence of new life. It's also confirmed by the fact that many later Irish and Scottish Brigid Day festivities were carried out by women, young and old. But fundamentally, this is just guesswork based on a very few pieces of evidence. St. Brigid's story contains elements so miraculous that modern scholars are still debating what they really mean. One thing we know for certain is that Saint Brigid was one of the most popular saints in medieval Ireland, second only to Patrick in fame and renown. In the Christian texts of medieval Ireland, we find many stories about this Saint Brigid of Kildare, including several imaginative biographies. These saints' lives introduce some supernatural elements into her story that have in more recent years been considered elements drawn from the pagan mythology of an earlier goddess. One particularly vivid account describes a miraculous incident. One day in that place, Brigid's mother went to milk, and she leaves nobody in her house except the holy girl who was asleep. They saw that the house had caught fire behind them. The people run to its aid, thinking that they would not find one house post against another. The house is found intact, and the girl asleep. Here, a miraculous light shining from the young Brigid's body was so strong it led everybody to believe that the house she was in was on fire. This association with fire can also be found in another early source, this time written in late 12th century Wales by Gerald of Wales. In his account of the monastery of Kildare, he describes an extraordinary tradition. As in the time of St. Brigid, 20 nuns were here engaged in the Lord's warfare, she herself being the 20th. After her glorious departure, 19 have always formed the society, the number having never been increased. Each of them has the care of the fire for a single night in turn, and, on the evening before the 20th night, the last nun, having heaped wood upon the fire, says, "Brigid, take charge of your own fire, for this night belongs to you." She then leaves the fire, and in the morning it is found that the fire has not gone out, and that the usual quantity of fuel has been used. Of course, just as with the other ancient festivals, Imbolc may also have been a time when fire played a ceremonial and perhaps even a ritual role. There could therefore be a connection between the Christian cult of St. Brigid and the ancient fires of Imbolc. But again, this is just an educated guess. The connection makes sense, but that's about all we can really say. It's not clear why the early Christians celebrated Brigid's Day on Imbolc. It may well have been the case that, as with Samhain being converted into All Saints' Day, they just took over a pre-Christian festival and attached their own saint to it. But another possibility is that Brigid herself was the pre-Christian goddess connected to Imbolc, and that as the festival was Christianized, she too was adopted into these church festivities as Saint Brigid. So the question I find myself asking is, if there was an earlier Brigid, who was she? Are there any signs of her in Irish mythology? You can download all of the sources I've used in this video, alongside other research I gathered, by following the link in the description. Enjoy! Many modern researchers and historians have claimed that the figure of St. Brigid has pre-Christian roots. But what sources are they drawing on to make this claim? Well, there are just 3 primary medieval sources that are usually used to make the case for the pre-Christian Brigid, and each one paints a slightly different portrait of this enigmatic figure. Perhaps the most famous source for Brigid the goddess is once again Cormac's Glossary, which provides our most detailed early description of her. The text introduces her as Brigid, the poetess, daughter of Dagda. This is Brigid, the female seer or woman of insight, i.e., the goddess whom poets used to worship, for her cult was very great and very splendid. It is for this reason that they call her the goddess of poets, Poetarum, by this title, and her sisters were Brigid, the woman of leechcraft, and Brigid, the woman of smithcraft, i.e., 3 daughters of the Dagda are they. This is an explicit description of a goddess. and places her quite high up in the native Irish pantheon as being the daughter of the Dagda, the good god, the father of several other deities in Irish myth, and occasional consort of the great goddess, the Morrigan. Being one of the three sisters of the same name, but with different skills and attributes, has led some to believe that she was originally a pre-Christian triple goddess. And we find several images of such goddesses in Iron Age iconography, and this could be another clue to the antiquity of Brigid as an ancient Celtic deity. When we turn to our second source, the Book of Invasions, we encounter a different aspect of Brigid. Brigid, the poetess, daughter of Dagda. She it is who had Fjord and Femen, the two oxen of Deal, from whom are named Moy Fjord and Moy Femen. Here once again she is Brigid the poetess, daughter of Dagda, but this time she's the keeper of two special oxen, who in turn give their names to two plains in Ireland, connecting her to the Irish landscape and suggesting her influence extended beyond the realm of poetry into the physical geography of Ireland itself. The third primary source, the Second Battle of Moychora, gives us one of the earliest stories to survive about this mythic Brigid, here named as Bree. In one short episode, we witness a deeply personal moment for her when she learns of the death of her son. Then Bree comes and bewailed her son. She shrieked at first, she cried at last, so that then for the first time crying and shrieking were heard in Erin. Here Brigid is both an innovator and a figure of profound emotion, credited with founding the tradition of keening that played a vital spiritual role in Irish and Scottish Gaelic society. Professional keeners were highly respected members of the community, and their laments were made up of improvised verses praising the dead with traditional refrains. This public ceremony involved the lead keener performing the main verses, while other mourners would join in the refrains, creating a powerful communal expression of grief. Here again we find a mythic Brigid connected to public declamation, particularly powerful words sung by women in praise of the dead. Yet again, these three ancient Irish sources make no mention of this mythic Brigid's connection to Imbolc or February 1st. If we are indeed looking at different aspects of the same goddess in these texts, then she's a multifaceted deity with many strings to her bow. In one of medieval Ireland's greatest epics, there's a family with an extraordinary secret. 3 generations of women who shaped law, justice and tradition. And their names are all variants of Brigid. But was this just coincidence or something more profound? In my research, I came across a piece of work that may tell us a little more about Brigid's myth. These are materials and ideas presented in a blog by Yvonne Burrow called The 3 Brigids of the Ulster Cycle. Beyond the sources I've already covered, there are several other characters in Irish literature who are also called Brigid. It's usually assumed that the majority of these other Brigids share nothing beyond their name with the daughter of the Dagda. But Yvonne Burrow believes we shouldn't dismiss them so quickly. She argues that there's another trinity of Brigids hidden in the Ulster Cycle, and their story has some powerful resonances with Brigid, the triple goddess. Yvonne Burrow has identified 3 related female characters whose names carry the prefix Bree. They're all family relations of Seneca mac Allella, poet and judge to Conover mac Nessa, being his mother, wife and daughter. These women also have their own interesting epithets. The title Bruggu marked Seneca's mother, Bree Bruggu, as a high-status hospitaller in ancient Irish society. These wealthy landowners held honour prices equal to tribal kings and maintained a sacred duty of unlimited hospitality. Her embodiment of Celtic generosity could have influenced later tales of Saint Brigid's legendary charitable nature. Seneca's wife, Brigid of the Judgments, played a crucial role alongside her husband in shaping Ulster's great hero Cuchulainn, teaching him eloquence. Their fostering connection mirrors Saint Brigid's later role as foster mother in Gaelic tradition. Together with Seneca, she helped maintain peace in Ulster through diplomatic wisdom. Brigid of the Cowlus, Seneca's daughter, also had a close connection to the law and championed justice despite her privileged status. Her defining moment came when she corrected her own father's unjust ruling on women's rights. She also earned recognition as Ireland's foremost female authority in wisdom. Now, there are other sources that tell of these women, but what we have here already proves these three Brigids embody different aspects of status and learning. What we might be looking at here is a second trinity of Brigids, mother, wife and daughter, all directly related to a learned poet and judge. Now, while these women are presented as historical mortal women in the Ulster cycle, rather than explicit goddesses, through their names they still have the quality of avatars, earthly manifestations of the goddess's power working through 3 generations of a single family, and like Cormac's Brigid, a family directly involved in poetry and learning. As we find with other noble women in the Celtic tradition, such as Ceridwen and Macha, to name just a few, goddesses weren't just distant figures of myth. Their powers manifested through real women who shaped enchantments, law, poetry and tradition. Their stories offer us a glimpse into a world where the divine and human realms were closely intertwined, where women wielded significant authority, and where the power of Brigid could flow through generations of a single family. When looking at ancient Irish stories of Brigid, we're not seeing one tradition, but many, like different streams all flowing from the same source. And at the point where these streams meet, we might find the key to understanding how a goddess became a saint. There were clearly many different lineages of law-keepers and storytellers who all had their own stories to tell about Brigid. Different versions of Brigid would have coexisted across these different lineages. But that said, there would have been common elements that all of these different lineages shared. When we compare the 2 sets of triple Brigids, for example, the one from Cormac's Glossary and the other in the Ulster cycle, we find that the most common element they share is that of learning and knowledge. In ancient Celtic society, poets were considered amongst the most learned, and as with Seneca, the son, husband and father of 3 Brigids, they were often practised in other disciplines, such as law. Brigid is, in many ways, a mother of knowledge and inspired intellectual pursuits, especially amongst women. She was, like Ceridwen in the Welsh bardic tradition, directly involved in the practice of the fine arts. But none of this tells us anything about her connection with Imbolc. The only sources that appear to confirm this connection are those that we find in the Christian tradition, and that presents us with 2 possibilities. The first is that Brigid was a pre-Christian goddess amongst the ancient Irish, perhaps a triple goddess with many of the attributes we've already looked at, but one who wasn't necessarily associated with Imbolc. Instead, it was the Christian tradition that made that connection, as it sought to impose its own Saint's Day on the pagan festival. It just so happened that the saint was called Brigid, and so unconnected to the mythical Brigid. In that situation, we would expect some of the pagan characteristics of the festival to have been absorbed into the Saint's Day. This is why many historians believe the legends about Saint Brigid contain pagan elements. But there's also a second possibility, and one I think is more likely. The historical Saint Brigid lived at a time when Christianity was still a new religion in Ireland. She was amongst the first few generations of Christians to be converted. This means that the native paganism of Ireland was still a strong cultural force in her day, and the early Christians would have sought ways to make conversion easier for the broader population. One way of doing this was to adopt elements of the older paganism into their Christianity. As we've already seen, noble women in early Celtic society appear to have been able to present themselves as avatars of some greater deity, embodiments of the divine, goddesses in mortal form. Brigid, therefore, would have been a very suitable name and identity for a spiritually powerful woman who wished to garner religious authority amongst her community. My own guess, and it is only a guess, is that Brigid the goddess was being evoked by Brigid the saint, and that this was a conscious and intentional echoing of the pagan deity by the Christian abbess. Just as early Christianity adopted the older pagan festivals, so too did they adopt as much as they could the trappings of the earlier paganism. I don't know if Brigid was the goddess of Imbolc or if that was a connection made by early Christians. It's really impossible to say, but I think it's very likely that there was indeed an ancient Brigid, and she bridged the divide between the old religion and the new. If you want to learn more about festivals like Imbolc and Samhain and the various other Celtic rites, you can take a look at the Celtic Rites on the CelticSource.online website.